welcome to my study. As you can see behind me, it's a little bit of a mess, but as long as the cameraman doesn't pan round too far, then I think we'll be okay and you won't know the truth of the situation in this room. But I wanted to welcome you all to our website and to encourage you to be with us on January the 19th, when at 8 p.m. at the Sovereign Performing Arts Centre we'll be performing a concert with mainly the string section of the Reading Symphony Orchestra. And I say mainly because the concerto we're going to be performing has an organ solo and also the addition of 3 timpani. So let's talk a little bit about the program. The first piece we have is by the English composer Gustav Holst, and it's his St. Paul Suite. Then we have Francis Poulenc's organ concerto, and we end the concert with the wonderful Serenade for Strings by Dvorak. Now, Holst is somebody we all know because of his wonderful piece for symphony orchestra, The Planets, one of the most famous pieces I think ever written for symphony orchestra. But he wrote lots of other music as well, and this is a small piece really that he wrote. He wrote this when he was actually the music teacher at St. Paul's Girls' School in Hammersmith in West London. So you might think it's going to be a very simple piece that just has very basic challenges for a string orchestra, but the truth is quite different. There are 4 movements to it. The first movement is a jig, a traditional English country dance, if you like, from the 16th, 17th centuries. And we finish with a very similar movement called a Dargason, which is a Morris dance. And if you know anything about Morris men, these are these guys who celebrate all sorts of focal points of the calendar with dancing and singing in public, and they have a huge number of dancers in their repertoire. This is one of those. The 2 come together in the most wonderful way. It's fascinating the way Holst combines those 2 themes. In the middle we also have a movement called an ostinato, which is a little bit like a country waltz, you might say. A little figure goes on in the second violins that's just so repetitive, which is what an ostinato means, and then we have a melody that is spun over the top of that from the first violins. Another movement is an intermezzo, which really exploits Holst's love of Eastern music. He was fascinated by lots of exotic things in the world, and music from the East was something that really inspired him as well. So we get some very wide intervals in there, and it has a quite distinctive flavour, very un-English at that point. So that's the St. Paul Suite by Holst. And then we move on to a composer, Francis Poulenc. Who I suspect not many of you will have heard his music before. He didn't write much music that's really performed today. There's a wonderful Gloria for choir and orchestra that's performed quite regularly, but this is one of his most dramatic pieces, and it's down to an American really that Poulenc was able to compose a great deal of his music. The Princess Edmond de Polignac, otherwise known as Miss Singer of Singer Sewing Machine fame. Her father, I think, was the company founder and certainly the man with all the money. She inherited much of this money, and after her own husband died at quite an early age, she lived in Paris and London and other places from her generosity. Now, Poulenc's music falls into several different categories, but he regards the organ concerto as being one of his religious and very serious works. He wasn't always a very religious man, but after the death of a musical colleague in 1935, he reverted to Catholicism and became quite an ardent Catholic after this date. The concerto falls into 7 sections, although it's really one long extended movement. And as I said, it's for organ solo, obviously, and strings, with the addition of timpani. It has one of the most arresting openings I've ever heard in music, and you'll, I think, instantly recognize this. And if you don't recognize it, you'll certainly be affected by it. It's very dramatic and very dark and eerie to begin with, and you can imagine yourself in some dank cathedral in the middle of Europe, and not the best heated of places, of course. Then it moves on to something much more energetic, and I have to say that beyond this, Poulenc Organ Concerto, I think, is one of the most vital and exuberant pieces of music you will ever hear. It's also a very individual sound world that Poulenc uses, and I'm thrilled to be bringing his music to Reading for what I think is one of the first times, and I hope that some of his other works will be able to bring to you in the future as well. Soloist will be Dr. Randell Wolfe, who is Reading's own organist at the Trinity Lutheran Church in Reading. One of my favourite composers is Antonin Dvorak. Of course, he was the composer of the wonderful New World Symphony and of an equally marvellous cello concerto that I think is something familiar to most music lovers. The Serenade for Strings that we're going to play is from an earlier period of his life when he was very much in Europe and really trying to develop his career as a composer. It was written in 1875. I think he would have been about 33 or 34 at the time, hadn't long been married, and was getting support from a state fund that was, let's say, assessed by the composer Brahms and the critic Hanslick. So all of a sudden, Dvorak found himself being supported by several of the most influential musicians in Europe, and from that date he didn't really look back. The Serenade is a wonderful piece for string orchestra, and when I've conducted it before, I've been very fortunate to have conducted it with some Czech orchestras, and it's the most marvellous feeling when you stand in front of an orchestra and this gorgeous melody just unfurls in front of you. It's strange as well that Dvorak brings back that theme at the end of the fifth movement, so he frames the work perfectly, if you like. Other movements that I'd like you to listen out for are the fourth movement. It's a very interesting larghetto. This is really the emotional centre of the piece, if you like. But before that we have a very interesting waltz as the second movement, and a scherzo which is so typical of Dvorak. The Slavonic dances and works like that we all know so well, very often as encore pieces, are of the flavour of this scherzo. And interestingly, if we compare Holst from the beginning of the programme to Dvorak at the end, we get this wonderful feeling of how they draw upon indigenous music, if you like, from the country they lived in. Holst drew on English folk music. Dvorak, in his own way, drew on the traditions of Czech folk music. Well, enough of me and my study. I hope to see you at the Sovereign Performing Arts Centre on January the 19th to hear the strings of the Reading Symphony Orchestra playing music by Holst, Poulenc and Dvorak.